Good evening. I'm Ken Wissaker, and I'm honored and happy to welcome you to Intellectual Publics. We're coming to you from the Graduate Center at CUNY and grateful for their support for the program. This is our 10th season. The very first event was back in November 2014, featured Lisa Lowe and Jack Halberstam discussing their Perverse Modernity series, which they had started to provide a home for queer of color work that was central to them both, but not their own work. That event was followed by a session with Anne Svetkovich and Saidiya Hartman on the practice of writing and how their focus on new ways of writing was inseparable from the critical work they wanted to accomplish. Those very same themes are at the center of tonight's conversation, which I'm very excited about, between Jennifer Nash and Julietta Singh on the occasion of Jennifer Nash's new book, How We Write Now, Living with Black Feminist Theory, a title which puts it together right there. It's a moving and brilliant book, combining writing about loss and family, illness and grief, with literary readings and reflections on Black feminist theory. Intimate and close, while also about everything. A book that is like a long essay with thoughts that extend and reverberate far longer. I'm excited for the conversation tonight and the reflection on that reflection. In a sense, the conversation already has begun, since Jen reflects on Julietta's singular The Breaks in the book, in a section that considers Singh's version of losing one's mother to Saidiya's, then turns to the real-time moments of Jen realizing she was beginning to lose her own. So powerful. Jennifer Nash is Gino Barr Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University. She's the author of 4 books, all proudly published by Duke University Press: The Black Body and Ecstasy, Reading Race, Reading Pornography, Black Feminism Reimagined After Intersectionality, Birthing Black Mothers, and most recently, How We Write Now, Living with Black Feminist Theory. I was honored and very lucky to work with her on 2 of these, and the last 2 have been edited by my fabulous colleague, Elizabeth Alt. Jen is also the editor of Gender, Love from Macmillan, and a co-editor with Samantha Pinto of the Routledge Companion to Intersectionalities from Routledge. And she also co-edits with Sam Pinto the Black Feminism on the Edge book series at Duke University Press, which is where this book appears. Julietta Singh is Stephanie Bennett-Smith Chair of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Professor of English at the University of Richmond, an academic and nonfiction writer. Her work is rooted in post-colonial feminisms and ecological humanities. Her 3 books include Unthinking Mastery, Dehumanism and the Decolonial Entanglements from Duke, No Archive Will Restore You from Punctum, and The Breaks from Coffee House Press in 2021. She is co-director and writer of the feature-length experimental film, The Nest, National Film Board of Canada from 2025, also about loss. And Singh is the recipient of an American Council for Learned Societies Burkhardt Fellowship and is currently a visiting fellow at Princeton University's Humanities Council and Arizona State University Center for Imagination in the Borderlands. I think we are in for something really, really special tonight. I want to thank them both, and also Stephanie Guillet, who runs the program with me. Jen and Julietta will talk for a little more than an hour, and then we will take questions. The chat is open, but if you would put the questions in the Q&A, that will help us keep track of them. With that, I'm delighted to welcome Jennifer Nash and Julietta Singh. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Ken. Hey, Jen.
Hey, Julietta. Thanks for being here this evening.
Thanks for being here with me too. Let's start by thanking Ken and Stephanie for all of the background work that goes into making an event like this, and this event in particular, happen, for making the space for it to happen. And thank you to everybody who's joining us, who I haven't yet been able to peruse. I always love that. who's out there? But whoever you are, thank you for joining us. And thank you, Jen, for writing this really incredible book that makes the occasion for us to be together for an hour and a half tonight. I wanted to start by saying, first of all, this is not supposed to be a book event, but more of an in conversation, but the book is at the center of our conversation. And I think it's such a brilliant jumping off point for so many things. As Ken just said, the book is about everything, but in particular about beauty and loss and mothers and motherhood and daughterhood. And I wanted to start by doing something that I think is not often done in these kinds of events that I wish was done more, which is to name our relationship. So we often see intellectuals or writers in conversation with each other without really knowing who they are to each other or how they are to each other. And I have been thinking a lot about friendship. I'm teaching a class right now on friendship and thinking a lot about the politics of friendship and the possibilities of friendship. And I wanted to say that we have been in conversation, mostly virtual, over fleeting emails for at least a couple of years now. And that we're a really particular kind of friendship, which is that we know each other largely through each other's work. And I really love that form of friendship. So we're not in the nitty-gritty of the everyday with each other, but we're engaged with each other as thinkers. And in some ways, I think as sometimes counterintuitive thinkers, which I'm excited to talk with you about tonight. So I wanted to just name that certain and really dynamic kind of intimacy, which is the intimacy of knowing each other through our words, especially with regards to How We Write Now, which is a book about intimacy and proximity through language and writing. So I'm going to begin again by reading a passage from your book, not only to give folks a sense of the writing, but also the focus. If you have a copy of Jen's magnificent book, I'm starting on page 4, the full paragraph on page 4 and all the way up to a couple of lines on page 5. And I'm doing this not just to give the audience a sense of the book, but also in some strange sense to give you back to yourself.
Right. Yeah.
So let's see how it goes. How We Write Now maintains that the paradigmatic form of Black loss that Black feminists have made visible is articulated through a singular kind of voice. Indeed, contemporary Black feminist theory insists that theory has a voice, or should have a voice. It is an affectively saturated voice, a deliberately revelatory voice, a voice that discloses, truth tells, and stays close to the bone. It is a voice that is deployed to make visible what Black loss feels like, how it moves under the skin, how it shapes Black inner lives, how it organizes Black sociality and interiority. This voice speaks in an intimate register. It grapples with the ethics of disclosure, the risk of saying too much or too little. This is a writing that willingly bears the chance of meeting a reader who exclaims, "All this emotional stuff just leaves me cold," and does nothing to mitigate that risk. This voice intentionally speaks intimately to its reader. We might even think of it as a whispering to its reader, with an attention to language that is poetic, with an investment in how words sound when they are read or heard, and with a commitment to the fact that words are always more than words, that books are more than books, that Black feminist theory does save our lives. Contemporary Black feminist texts insist that the act of writing and reading Black feminist theory can be, or perhaps should be, an act of care, wake work, defending the dead, gathering the ghosts, and taking our dead with us to the various battles we must wage in their names and in our own names. This body of writing carries with it a sense of the profundity and magnitude of what Black women have lost, not in the hopes of reparation or recuperation, but in the service of naming the always already there-ness of loss at various scales as constitutive of Black women's lives. It is a voice that is not just documentary in its capacity to record the felt life of grief, but also pedagogical in its capacity to offer tools for living with and living on. Beautiful. This is the term I have landed on to name the singular Black feminist voice that I describe, and at times deploy here. So let's start with beauty and beautiful. What's at stake in claiming beauty and thinking about Black loss?
Yeah. So first, thank you, Julietta. Thank you for reading that out loud. I had this moment earlier today where I thought, oh, I need to remember what's in the book, right? Because we write these books and then they go out into the world and they're both ours and not ours anymore, right? And so
Yes.
there's this moment of like, I should reread it and remember where I was when I wrote it. So for some time, which is to say for a few years, I've been trying to think about the voice of contemporary Black feminist studies, which to me, as a student of Black feminist theory and as someone who's been part of Black feminist conversations for 2 decades now, the voice of contemporary Black feminist studies feels different to me. It feels like the register in which we write has changed. And I wanted to attend to that and think through what it meant that a group of scholars and scholars working inside and outside of the university and creative writers and artists of all sorts who see themselves working within a Black feminist tradition were committed to forging a kind of intimacy with their reader. And we're committed to mobilizing a kind of literary voice to talk about the everyday. I saw a body of work that was interested in disclosure in different kinds of ways and interested in thinking about what is ours to disclose and what isn't. I see Christina Sharp really thinking about that. And in the wake, the very beginning, she has a moment where she says something like, she's writing about her family and she says something like, there are other stories here to tell, but they're not mine to tell.
Mm-hmm.
And so this real kind of grappling with what stories are ours, what do we share, what don't we share? And as I say in the book, it felt like the voice of contemporary Black feminist theory wants to move us. It may not. And as I often say to my students, I think if you read some of this work, say by Saidiya Hartman, by Christina Sharp, by Elizabeth Alexander, and you're not moved, I actually think the work requires that you pause and say, why am I unmoved?
Mm-hmm.
Which is in and of itself a powerful query.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to think about what I saw as a change. And as you know, I've always been interested in the affects of Black feminism. What I saw as a change in the kind of critical atmosphere of Black feminist writing. And I wanted to think about how so much of this writing that seemed to speak in a different voice also seemed to be preoccupied with loss and grief, even as it was often thinking about loss and grief on different scales.
Mm-hmm.
Although, as I argue in the book, it seemed to me that much of it was thinking about the kind of frame of Black loss that I think Black feminists have so importantly given us, which is about kind of state-sanctioned spectacular death of Black boys and men at the hands of the state. But this was a body of work that was using the literary and intimacy and slowness to get us as close to loss as possible, and to make the case that if we wanted to do justice to loss, we had to get close.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what I wanted to do in the book is both diagnose that, think about the moment that we were in, think about the emergence of a different kind of voice, and try that voice on simultaneously. Yeah.
I want to think about trying that voice on, which really resonates with me as a writer who's kind of worked variously across genre over time.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking today about birthing Black mothers and thinking about the way that you kind of enter into the frame there as a mother or as a mother to be, and kind of beginning to situate yourself in that book where it feels like a and otherwise more theoretically contained, bounded, writerly self that is beginning to emerge. as someone who sees a kind of self-location as instrumental to the work itself, and thinking about that book and moving to this one. And I wondered if you could think about where you were in that process of writing about yourself in a more kind of auto-theoretical or autobiographical way here.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So, I mean, I think in the previous three books, well, certainly not in the first book because I was whatever, pre-tenure scholar, right? But then as I sort of felt like I had my feet under me, I did what I think so many of us do, which was like, I'm going to frame a theoretical argument around a personal narrative that appears in the introduction and the conclusion. And I will introduce my question, situating myself, and then I will completely retreat and hide behind a fortress of evidence. Which, as someone who's trained in law, I love a fortress of evidence. Like that's my sweet spot. So I know how to do that. And then I came to this project, which was, as I said, a project about writing and about loss. And also, as I say in the book, I was watching my mother fade and deteriorate. And it seemed impossible and disingenuous to think about loss without thinking about her, right? Without thinking about, if my interest was in inviting Black feminism to attend to forms of loss that are not spectacular, that are slow and endured, and that are in the grind of the daily, especially for folks who know what it's like to offer care to others, right? I wanted to, it seemed like, how could I write this without thinking about what it's like to lose her in slow motion? It felt like the book required it, even as I felt uneasy about it. And there were times when I was writing this book where I would think, is this two books? Is this a book that's like, there's a theory project and there's a personal project? And then it seemed to me that what I wanted to do was to think about what it might mean to lay claim to the voice that I was seeing so many other Black feminists lay claim to. And in laying claim to it, I could both describe the moment that I find myself in, that I continue to find myself in, and I could also think about what that voice makes both possible and impossible, right? Because I think it illuminates a lot. I think writing this book helped me get so close to the minutia of slow loss, right? And helped me really think about, sometimes I'll talk about, my mother has Alzheimer's, so sometimes I'll talk about just that feeling when she's slipping through my fingers, right? And writing the book helped me think through that. But I also realized, and I talk about this in the book, the more I tried to get close to the feeling of loss, the more it eluded me, because part of what I was realizing is how much loss eludes its own telling, how we can't fix it or pin it down, how it exceeds language, how so much of, I think, the energy of contemporary Black feminist writing is it's always chasing loss to get as close as possible, and it can never quite get there, right? And so I think part of what writing this helped me realize was just that language wasn't enough to do justice to the magnitude and duration of loss that I was thinking through.
There's something really interesting about you thinking originally or while you were writing about whether it's two books. So for folks who haven't read it yet, the sort of like real narrative of losing your mom to Alzheimer's and beginning the book with, I don't want to badly paraphrase this amazing opening sentence. In the time it takes me to write this book, my mother may lose her capacity to read this sentence. And thinking about the ways that you're thinking with Black feminism as a Black feminist feels like you had learned through Black feminism how to write towards your mother in this way. And so far from being two books, two projects, it feels like you stepping into a discourse that you're diagnosing, that you're discovering. Diagnosing sounds too clinical, but like finding a voice within Black feminism that you really locate within the sort of emergence of Black Lives Matter forward as a discourse that helps you think with Black loss in particular, in specific relation to motherhood. And one of the things that I think is so amazing about how you do that is that most of the thinkers and writers that you're engaged with are thinking about a sort of like fast loss. A
Mhm.
child is killed by police. A husband suddenly dies
Mhm.
unexpectedly. And that at the same time, there's this sort of concurrent thread of your mom that's being woven through, and a loss that is moving with us through all of these other forms of loss that you're seeing as kind of all in dialogue.
Mhm. So it's funny when you used a phrase, you said that part of what the book indexes is the ways in which Black feminism has taught me how to write towards my mother. And one of the things, and this goes back to where we started about beauty, that I think I realized over the course of writing the book is that the book is a mark of my own desires, right?
Yeah.
It is, I mean, and that's where it ends. There's no spoilers. That's sort of where it ends, right? I'm trying to mark in this book a desire to memorialize or hold my mom in a moment where she's still somewhat recognizable to me. But as I know that the gap between when I finished that last sentence and now is that she's less recognizable than she was.
Yeah.
So what I'm marking through language, through a voice that I'm calling beautiful is an archive of my own desires, right? A desire to hold her close and a recognition that I can't, not in the way that I want to, right? That I can't stop the deterioration that continues to unfold. And so I think part of what I'm trying to think through with beautiful language is like, what are the desires that Black feminists are marking when we mobilize this language? And I think you're right that, I have a moment towards the very beginning where I say, wrapped up in this conversation about beauty and loss is a conversation about mothers, and yes, about daughters, both. And while I think much of that conversation has unfolded in Black feminist studies in ways that try to exceed the biological, I also think Black feminism loves its mothers. Right? I think if you look through the Black feminist theoretical archive, there is a preoccupation with thinking through the maternal, with thinking through what it means to do justice to the maternal, with thinking about whether we can sort of in an Alice Walker vein, recover our mothers, return to our mothers, thinking with you and with Hartman, what it means to lose our mothers, what it might mean to treat that loss, that break, channeling your amazing book, right? To think that as a generative break and not necessarily one that's entirely about violence, trauma, and anti-Blackness. So I think there's, I mean, if I were to think about the through lines that mark Black feminism, certainly this preoccupation with mothers, maternity, motherlands, mother tongues is one that seems central, right? So in a way, I think for a long time, we've been writing towards our mothers, right? We Black feminists have been writing towards our mothers, but using different voices to do that writing. So it feels like the voice of the present, which is, as you noted, for me, feels important to mark as a kind of Black Lives Matter. And I think one of the things that happened with the publication of the book is we went from a moment where Black Lives Matter had currency to a moment where DEI has died, right? And so it's also interesting to mark what has changed even since I finished writing the book. But I think I was writing this in a moment where it's also the case that mothers had a particular currency for Black Lives Matter. And we're grieving mothers, we're Black grieving mothers, we're the face of a political movement. So I want to mark that because it feels important to me in doing justice to the archives. When I think of someone like Christina Sharp in Ordinary Notes, I mean, she ends the book by telling us it's a love letter to her mother, right? Or even in her essay, Beauty is a Method, it's entirely her way of learning beauty's knowledges is about her mother. It's her mother who instructs her on beauty as a way of knowing. So all this to say, I think mothers are this kind of critical point of connection between the kind of dominant voice of Black feminism that I want to chart and the preoccupation with loss that I'm writing about.
I was thinking about what you were saying about your first book, and being like, I was hiding behind. And one of the things that I really want to think with you about tonight is the question of how we write now as something that I always want to make sure isn't predetermined. So that when we're thinking of form and when we're thinking about genre and when we're thinking about experimentation, which are all kind of key words in the kind of build up to this conversation, that I think that there is a propulsion right now toward feeling like you have to write in a certain way and you have to disclose in a certain way. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is I sort of, I think, made a bit of a mistake, not a mistake, but like a professional mistake when I wrote my first book, Unthinking Mastery, which was mostly a theory book, my first academic theory book. And in that book, I had gotten a reviewer's report back that was remarking on my trying to think about vulnerable reading. What does this practice of vulnerable reading look like? And how do we become vulnerable readers? Which is to say, how do we allow texts to change us? And I think what you do and how we write now is to like model how texts change you in a very palpable way. And the reader asked me, what does vulnerable writing like? And that reader turned out to be Jack Halberstam. I always like to name Jack in this because it was a really important moment. And I didn't know Jack at the time. And so I thought, okay, what does vulnerable writing look like? And it was before I had been introduced to the world of writing that you're writing about in this book. You know, I came out of grad school as a comparative literature, South Asian studies trained person without any kind of access to Black or very little access to Black feminism and the sort of like worlds of American studies or queer theory, etc. And I thought, how do I write vulnerably? And the way that I could see to do that was to include where I was at personally in the stakes of what I was writing about, right? So that was my first kind of like stepping in. And after I published the book, a senior feminist scholar was like, that was a very bold move to make in your first book. But I didn't even know enough to know that that was a bold move. You know, it's like, I was just trying to figure out what vulnerable writing looked like. And it sort of opened the door for me to thinking about other ways of writing. And I'm saying this because as we move toward a, a much more, so your book is sort of is showing us a world of Black feminist theory that is that engages I'll call it a poetics of Black loss that is moving away from the spectacular moments of loss into the kind of like mundane, the quotidian, the sort of like everyday of being in loss, with loss, through loss, alongside loss, I guess. And that I think that there's this world, and then there's a world of writers who are trying to figure out like what's my voice or where's my voice, and feeling like they have to model that, right?
Yeah.
And that I'm curious about how you think about that beyond Black feminism,
Yeah.
how you think about the question of how we write now when we really expand that we.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I mean, so I'm going to start thinking about that in relationship to Black feminism, and then we can sort of move to it. I mean, I think one of the questions that I've been interested in for as long as I've been a Black feminist theorist is how can we hold space for Black feminist multiplicity, right? And this has been an enduring question for me. And so, I mean, one of the things that really interests me is that there's a way in which this most recent book is understood, and rightfully so, as vulnerable, right? It's one that discloses, it's one that's personal, it's one that's intimate, it's one where I as the author, I'm not hiding. And yet I find myself also thinking, is that the hallmark of the vulnerable, right? Or to ask another way, when has Black feminism ever not written vulnerably?
Yeah.
So when, I think about, I've been working on this piece about Black feminist arithmetic, and I've been thinking about the late 1980s when Kimberly Crenshaw writes those foundational articles on intersectionality, which I don't think are articles that are often described as marked by poesis, right? They appear in law reviews. She's preoccupied with anti-discrimination law and legal doctrine. And yet one thinks these are articles that she published in law reviews that were making a claim that the very architecture of anti-discrimination law was in and of itself discriminatory. How could we not understand just articulating that claim as one that is a kind of vulnerable writing, even if the voice that she was using to engage in the vulnerable act of re-envisioning everything about anti-discrimination law, even if that voice was not an intimate voice,
Yeah.
right? Is there not something still vulnerable about the demand that she's articulating?
Yeah.
So all this to say, like, I hear in your question, you use the word predetermined. I hear in it my own anxiety about arriving in a moment when there is a demand for writers generally, but I think Black feminist writers in particular, to expose themselves.
Yeah.
And that exposure is considered the hallmark of not just vulnerability, but of being radical and transgressive and ethical. And so I am really interested in the sense that in sort of pushing against that, right? And thinking about the market forces
Yeah.
that require that Black feminist writers reproduce the field in a certain kind of a way, right?
Yeah.
Which I think also includes, as many of the writers that I write about and How We Write Now are, the birth of the crossover text, the Black studies academic celebrity who tweets and writes trade books that are really popular, right? Like there are these models for Black feminist writing that exceed the academy now, that have become their own types, right? So I think if when I got my PhD, the routes that I saw were like, you either publish a book on Duke University Press if you're incredibly lucky, or maybe one day, after you've written 20 books, you too can write a trade book. But now there are these other pathways, right? But those pathways are also predetermined, right?
Mhm.
So I think, all this to say, my interest is in how we can craft space to how we can craft space for the heterogeneity of Black feminist production, right? That it can look like this, that it can look like Crenshaw, that it can look like Spillers, that it can look like De Silva, that we don't have to necessarily think that one of those is more vulnerable than the other. They're all deploying different kinds of voices.
Yeah. And that there's a way of thinking about the how we write now, the very question, there's a way of thinking about the writing not just as a matter of voice, but
Mhm.
as a matter of commitment. Like not the voice which you're deploying, but the force through which you enter the writing, the commitment, the intention through which you enter, as opposed to how you sound, right? And this book is like about the beauty, and I love it. So like there's so much more to say about beauty. Yeah, to just like think along that on in terms of market forces too. I wanted to tell a little story about the breaks, which is that I was, as I say in the breaks, which is a letter to my daughter about race and mothering at the end of the world. And in that book, which was genuinely like truly a letter to my kid, like I wrote it as a letter to my kid. When I sought out an agent for the book in this crossover mode, the agent was like, "That's great, super excited." And then a New York Times article came out about the new Black epistolary. And it was citing Baldwin, it was citing Between the World and Me, of course, but it was also, I think Amani Perry's book had just come out and I hadn't read it yet, the beautiful, beautiful book, Breathe, that you write about in How We Write Now. And she contacted me and she was like, hey, the market is full right now of the epistolary forum, and especially dominated by Black voices. And could you rewrite the book not as a letter? And I, in that moment of like, I actually was like, let me try. And I think I spent like 2 days and was like, I can't, like it's actually a letter. And I wouldn't, by undoing that, you're undoing the whole kind of like motive for entering into it in the first place, right? Like the reason for it was a letter to my kid. So to undo the letter to my kid was an undoing of the entire project. But just to think with the ways that those market forces are driving how we write now, and risking in some sense a repetition. Like, what does it mean to step into a voice or a mode that's already been done, but obviously and invariably with a difference, right? Because you are you, and you are losing your mother and the particularities of losing your mother in this book, which isn't the same as any of the other losses in the book, even while they're all kind of congealing to show us something about the sort of like aesthetics and ethos and commitments of Black feminist theory now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about repetition is really key, right? That there's this way in which, especially in that moment where there was a Black Lives Matter literary market, there was a sense that Black feminist writing, first of all, had to take on Black loss in a particular way, right? And that Black loss meant that it was about the loss of boys and men. It was about anticipated loss. It was, as Elizabeth Alexander called it, about the Trayvon generation. So for Alexander, it was about mothering not just her own children, but this generation. It was, as you mentioned, Imani Perry's book, Breathe, about the intense anxiety about raising Black boys
Mhm.
in an anti-Black world. Like that was what was desired. There was a hunger for those kinds of texts, and those texts were being reproduced and rewarded, right? There was that moment in 2020 when the New York Times bestsellers list was, for the first time, largely populated by Black women writers and Black feminist writers, right? And at that same time, and I think this is still ongoing, you have this kind of proliferation of Black feminist self-help books, right? So you had, this is more recent, but you had Rest as Resistance, you had The Body is Not an Apology, which was kind of another pathway for Black feminist writing, right? Is in, I'm going to offer you a way of, I would say, these authors wouldn't say disciplining yourself, right? That is a form of radical resistance, but is also a form of discipline, right? So if you rest more and here's how you do it, or you recognize that you need not apologize for your body, you're enacting and performing a kind of Black feminist politics in the world. So you had these pathways that were carved out for Black feminist writing. And then one thinks like, the repetition sort of becomes built into that system because that's what's getting published, right? So those are the ways for Black feminist writing. And so you don't see other kinds of voices appearing. And at the same time, and I think this is true of many fields, but it is certainly true of Black feminist studies, there are questions or topics that become impossible to pose within the house of Black feminism, right?
Yeah.
So like when I mentioned Kimberly Crenshaw before, when I think of a vast body of Black feminist literature from the late 80s and early 1990s that wrote about law, right? Those are questions that have become so wildly unpopular that if you were just, unless you're writing about, say, a kind of Michelle Alexander New Jim Crow, kind of diagnosing hyper-incarceration, if you are to write about law, and particularly your own desires for or entanglements, right, with law reform or rights, those are questions that are in some ways impossible to pose from within the feminism now, which means that there's certain kinds of writing that we simply don't see circulating in the world. So I think the idea of repetition is key. I think the idea of markets is key. And then I think, as I said, then there was this cliff, right? Like there were all these editors who were Black editors who were hired to diversify mainstream publishing. And then we've kind of reached the end of that era. So I think it will be really interesting to see what voices circulate and are in demand, what appetites are cultivated for Black feminist writing or not cultivated in this kind of DEI moment.
Totally. I'm also curious to see where you then go from here, like where you land from here. I didn't say that that my agent came back and was like, wait a minute, hold the phone. I made a terrible mistake in asking you to do this because you're writing a letter to your daughter. And that doesn't yet, there isn't a world of that. And I think part of the desire to do it was because I was so affected by these extraordinary letters, first written by the ones that I encountered first were written by black men to sons or nephews, and then from mothers to sons, and really thinking about a kind of maternal genealogy and what it means to write to a daughter. And this brings me to something that I've really wanted to talk to you about, which is How We Write Now is a book that really deals exclusively with Black feminist writers. And then my book appears for several pages in a way that makes it either a unicorn or a misfit. I'm not sure which one. but I wondered if you could talk about in a book so intensely, intimately, deeply committed to Black feminist prose, beautiful Black feminist prose that are dealing with loss and through loss. What is the Breaks doing there?
Yeah, it's both the unicorn and the misfit, Julietta. So I think,
Thank you. That's my new gender
search is in
identity.
one. When I got your book, which I think was in 21, one of the things that really struck me about it was the question that I ask about many of the books that I write about, which is like, what is this thing, right?
Yeah.
Like it says on the cover that it's an essay, it's a long essay, it's a letter. And I couldn't place it, which in some ways I think is what I also teach your book, No Archive Will Restore You. And one of the things we always start by talking about is like, what is this thing? How do we understand what this is?
Yeah.
And so I was drawn into trying to understand what this text that refused classification was. I was really drawn into the engagement with Hartman. And so, as you know, I think as many folks on the Zoom know, my own relationship to Black feminism is perhaps more capacious and promiscuous than most, which is to say,
Yeah.
I see Black feminism as a mode of thought, right?
Yes.
And so it's so obvious to me that the Breaks, and you're explicit about this, is indebted to Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother, and that you're really trying to think with the multiplicity of meanings in Lose Your Mother, and to think about what I see as different kinds of quiet losses of our mothers, and to think about kinds of losses that might be required, that might be necessary for us to flourish. And so I was writing this chapter about Black feminist engagement with the letter. To go back to your story about your agent, I was writing about Imani Perry's book and about Breathe. And I was trying to think about why we see so many letters, right? Like there was just, as you said, there was this flurry of letters, and it became a form that was familiar, right? And I think we as readers had expectations about the letter. The letter is where Black mothers talk to their sons. Perhaps it's where you offer the talk about the reality of anti-Black violence, or perhaps it's where you talk about your own anxiety about mothering a Black child, particularly a Black son. There were a slew of letters published in 2020 in newspapers and magazines that were by pregnant Black people describing their anxiety about giving birth to Black children in an anti-Black world. So there was a sense of like, I know what the letter is. And yet they continue to be published. And I love Imani Perry's Breathe, so this is in no way a critique. But then I came to your book, which is using that form and offering me an entirely different, and I think deeply Black feminist understanding of what loss might look like. And in my own book, where I was trying to think about losses that might be quiet, losses, as I say in the beginning of the book, one of the things I'm interested in is how loss can take so many different forms.
Yeah.
And while my book is in some ways overdetermined by my slow loss of my mother, I say at the very beginning, I'm so interested in other losses. I'm interested in what it means to lose the familiarity of a place. I'm interested in what it means to lose friendships. I'm interested in what it means to lose memories. I'm interested, as an academic who's moved institutions, I'm interested in what it means when I no longer know where the bathroom is in the building where I teach. Like all of these are different kinds of losses, right? And some of them feel freeing and exciting, and some of them feel tragic. I'm understanding them all as loss. And I come to your book that I think is also trying to think about the kind of the various valences of loss that perhaps we need to break from our mothers, and that perhaps those breaks can be, I think at some point you use the word tender, that perhaps those breaks don't have to be ruptures, right? But splits. So it felt to me important to put that in conversation with Perry, to think about the variety of kinds of losses that the letter could imagine, right? So that we can see this form that we know, and it can be doing different kinds of work in relationship to loss. Even as your book, much like Perry's, is, I think, deeply intimate. At some point in the introduction to the book, I talk about how so many of the texts that I write about, I feel like they whisper in our ears, right? They beg us to come close. And I think your book is like that also, right? And I'd be curious to hear if this is your experience of having the breaks in the world. I think I feel I know you after reading this book, right? Which I think is actually also part of the fiction of the kind of voice the kind of beautiful voice that I'm interested in, right? Like my book came out into the world, and one of the things that's been so interesting about it is that people know me in a different way. Or at least they know the me that's constructed on the page, which is to say everything in the book is true.
Yeah.
Right? but there's this, like, I think readers feel like kind of intimacy with me that's been interesting for me to navigate. And also interesting in terms of thinking about what kinds of talks I want to give, or like,
Yeah.
when people say to me, "How's your mom?" And I'm like, "Oh,
Yeah.
I'm kind of undone by that question," right? Like,
Yeah.
so
Don't ask me that all the time.
right,
Yeah.
right, exactly, right.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something, I have many different kinds of responses, and one is that you were saying at one point earlier in our conversation that that the sort of like vulnerable writing, the writing vulnerably meant that you're not hiding, as opposed to a kind of more straightforwardly academic book. And I think that there's something really, I have come to think about writing as a life writing, auto-theoretical writing as a form of curation. So people will often say, like, how do you get so vulnerable? How do you not kind of walk out in the world feeling like everybody knows too much about you, without thinking about how our work as writers is like literally to craft, right? And so knowing parts of you that people might not know if you were writing academically isn't the same thing as knowing a version of you that a dear friend would know, for instance, right? It's knowing an artistic side of yourself that includes some aspects of the realities of your life, the conditions of your life. And so I'm always interested in that sort of line between people know things about me, and I have put things in the world very specifically that people know about me. And sure, there are moments where you're like, wish I hadn't included that, but in the same way that I feel like, wish I hadn't included that in an academic book, where I'm like, I think differently about that now, or I would have represented this differently. And so, I'm thinking a lot about how we write now, because and my location therein, which I want to say is in part interesting to me, because I'm such a hybrid person, as a body, genealogically, I'm such a hybrid person, that I don't think that I've ever had a named world in which I felt that's my world, you know? And so I feel very indebted to Black feminist thought. I feel very indebted to brown feminist thought. I guess I could say I'm a brown feminist, or I'm a queer brown feminist, or whatever sort of like categories we want to kind of lay claim to, or that describe us, um, or what have you, but that there's something about the sort of like lack of fittedness all around, in which I'm always kind of like a bricoleur that's taking from this and taking from this to try to find a thing that describes and names and allows me to think and feel in the ways that I want to. And so there's something really interesting about me landing in this book alongside people who are unequivocally identifiably Black feminist theorists, and then this kind of like little weird thing. And it's cool, it's interesting, and it's also like a way of understanding a multi-directional indebtedness of mine, where I didn't, I wrote The Breaks thinking, wow, I was really trained in a kind of continental philosophy, white man world. Like I was really schooled in that world. And what would it mean to write a book in which I'm only engaging, and it's not, it's kind of subtle in the book, but I'm only engaging with brown and Black feminist thinkers in that book, with a shout out to a couple of letter writing Black men. Thank you. But for the most part, it's really trying to kind of bring myself into a world and write with and toward that world. And I wanted to say that one of the things about, you were saying that Christina's book ends with like, this is a letter to my love letter to my mother. And of course, how we write now is also unequivocally a love letter to your mom. And one of the things that I kept thinking about when I reread it in anticipation of our conversation to me about how, for me, the breaks was a way of preemptively trying to, is my internet connection okay, Jen?
It's better now. It had frozen for a second.
Okay. A way of me trying to give to my daughter a series of things that I desired from my own mother, a series of things that I wish I could have that I didn't have or can't have, and a way of letting her understand me, again, and obviously in a curated way, but letting her understand me in ways that I, like, if I could take a leap into her vantage points as an older person, what do I think she would want to know? Not just what would I want to know, but what would she want to know? And I was thinking about that so much in How We Write Now, because so much of it is this attempt to kind of like look back and understand your mom and even understand your dad, like, and understand their relation, but to understand your mom as a historical subject, as somebody in the present, who's becoming someone other to themselves or other than themselves through the experience of Alzheimer's. And that our books are in a very strange way kind of sutured together in that way as a kind of giving desire text, like a text that's really grappling with what we want from our mothers, what we need from our mothers, what we need as daughters, what we wish for, what we long for, and the way that we know that we've lost it or know that we can't have it, but are still trying to kind of give it and go after it anyway.
Yeah. I mean, you have this moment in the breaks, since you read me to me, I'll read you to you. You have this lovely moment in the breaks towards the end where you say, I want to hand myself over so that you don't have to go in search of me, so you can draw forward what you need to reinvent the world. And it's for those who have the breaks. It's towards the very end on 141. And so I think, I think when I say that Black feminism has this preoccupation with mothers, I mean, I think it's a preoccupation with that bond, that complicated, fraught, messy bond between mothers and daughters, right? And how it's negotiated, what daughters want from mothers. As I said, I think my book is so much a mark of desire. It ends with me saying, all I want is more time, right, to be my mother's daughter. And the sense of constantly wanting something. And I think part of the struggle of the book, which I think comes across on the page, is this sense that I think I still have, that if I can only find out everything about my mother,
Yeah.
I can know her. And in this moment where she's unknowable to me, if I can only find out who she was dating in 1970, right? I
Yeah.
can know.
You'll understand everything.
Right. And of course, even if my mother did not have Alzheimer's, I couldn't know her, right?
Yes.
And even as a young child, I found myself constantly coming up against the places that she didn't want me to know. And of
Yeah.
course, then I was drawn to those places, but I would constantly come up against them. And that's why I think that moment in Christina Sharp's In the Wake has always spoken to me, that question of like, what is not ours to know? And how
Yeah.
do we know what those moments are? I have a moment in the book where I say, I hope that, one day when my daughter is my age, she'll grant me a kind of privacy that I probably haven't granted my mother in this
Yeah.
book. Right? And that's complicated. So when you were talking about curation and thinking about personal writing as a form of curation, I think that's right. And I also think to myself, of course, I have roped in to myself writing a set of figures who may or may not want to be on the page, right? And so it's been interesting to have the book live in the world when it's very much about my father. When my daughter appears, there's this picture which she had mixed feelings about, because in part she doesn't look like this anymore. And one of the things I always say to her when she looks at this picture is, well, none of us are these people anymore, right?
Yeah.
I certainly, as I joke, that was how I looked before I started the demands of this job. I somehow
My
look
old look. Yeah.
My daughter is now, probably 5 years older than she was in that picture, and my mother doesn't look like that anymore. There's just something that's fundamentally changed.
Yeah.
But part of what I always say to my daughter is like, the book is a mark that none of us are who we were when I started this book,
Yeah.
right? And when she returns to it, if my daughter wants to return to this book, if she has curiosities about my life, when she comes to it, none of us will be the people we are now, right?
Yeah.
And so part of what I want for her is to have that curiosity about what it means that we're constantly shifting. But I think you're right to again, to like put a pin on the question of desire and how much that animates the kind of friction between mother and daughter that I think has permeated the Black feminist archive. I mean, look at Rebecca and Alice Walker, right? No more complicated maternal daughter dyad than that, but saturated by desire on both sides.
Yeah, yeah. There's something interesting too about thinking toward there's a moment in the book where you say, my partner and I have agreed not to write
Yes.
about and that you make really clear that there are limits even while you worry about
Yep.
even while you worry about having over disclosed in other areas. And I always joke and say, you know, the the problem with having a writer mom is that or a writer or anyone, writer, you know, is that you're subject to some kind of engagement, not without care,
Yeah,
not
for
without
sure.
care, not without curation, but that there's a kind of, and not in a vampiric way, but just that your life comes through what you write, regardless of whether or not it's made explicit, right? Which is why
Absolutely.
I'm thinking back to that. Like, it's not that we have to say everything. It's not that we even have to write autobiographically.
Right.
It's that we come to it with a fullness of being and intention and desire that is made manifest through the relationship to the prose.
Right. And I mean, so it's funny as you were saying that, I was reminded of this moment in Pat Williams's Alchemy of Race and Rights, where she's talking about a conversation with her sister. And in recounting the conversation itself might simply be a device, right? Whether or not it happened, I do not know. But she's talking about how her sister insists that everything that Pat Williams writes in the book has to be 100% factually correct and has to be represented exactly how it happened. And Pat Williams keeps saying, well, everything that I write about actually happened, but
Yeah.
maybe not necessarily in the order I describe it. I might be
Yeah.
bundling some events. And her sister's like, well, then it's not true.
Yeah.
Right. And I think of how the book has lived in the world for my father, because he reads it as someone who wants to see truth. So he will say to me, you know, there's a moment in the book that you say this happened in 1972, but it was 1973. You should get the press to fix that. And I'm like, you know, that's
Yeah.
not really what the effort here was, but
Yeah.
it's just interesting to think about, as I said, like what it means for the book to live in the world for him. He appears on the page in a way that I think he finds charming and interesting, but didn't necessarily desire, right?
Yeah.
As I said, he feels, I think, exposed in a way that I think is not uncomplicated for him.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, my mother feels the same way. I've written about her kind of repeatedly across time in various ways, and um, it's always a sort of toggle between, well, you're a writer, and it's your craft, and you see the world through your vantage point, and you represent me however you want to, and then the reality of reading it and being like, ugh. And,
Right.
you know, one of the other things that I wanted to talk to you about is this idea um, of companionship, of closeness, of citing, I think, Elizabeth Alexander, this staying close to the bone. But I'm thinking a lot about this new film project that I just finished, which was in part a kind of like documenting of my mom at the end of her life, and thinking with the sort of structure that she's like the brick and mortar structure that she's lived in for almost half a century, and finding the other minoritized girls and women who have lived in this house over 140 some odd years of settler colonial history in Canada. And in that project, one of the things that was happening for me is that as I was kind of documenting my mom and interviewing her and seeking out this kind of intimacy with her at the end of her life that I very much desired, because I wanted this like last ditch, we can do this thing together. We can kind of recreate the world together, which is an impulse that I also write toward my daughter in the breaks, that I don't want to stop just because of age or just because of disability or just because of anything, that I want to always hold open the possibility of some kind of change or of finding each other differently, despite the conditions, physical, emotional, geopolitical, that we're living through. And that in the process of making that film, what I was discovering was all of these other communities that belong to the house over time, all of these other kind of forgotten matriarchs, really radical women, more subtle mothers, really like baller anti-colonial revolutionaries, like just the gamut of girls and women who had lived in that space over time. And I started to think toward and feel my way toward a network that was certainly maternal, maybe more than maternal, maybe also rooted in a kind of sisterhood or like a feminist solidarity that was another kind of kinship model.
Mhm.
And in thinking with that and feeling my way toward that, understanding that all of this desire wrapped up in the mother and in the maternal and in the desire to have certain forms of like answers and intimacies that we could kind of find them disparately, intimately and disparately. And so I was thinking with your book in terms of how much you find closeness and intimacy in searching for your mother and desiring your mother and losing your mother. Also kind of being with and being alongside all these other women as maternal figures, as sisters, as allies of various kinds within the world of Black feminist theory and Black feminist poetics.
Yeah, I really appreciate, Julietta, you mentioning Elizabeth Alexander. I was so struck when I read this interview with her and Sheryl Sandberg, both of them reflecting on loss. Alexander has this moment where she talks about how she felt this kind of compulsive need to write after her husband died, and the sense that if she stopped writing, or when she stopped writing, and she says this in Light of the World also, she wouldn't be as close to him, right?
Yeah.
That the act of writing was what was keeping them close. And the sense of writing as an act of providing companionship to loss really was, for me, sort of at the heart of the project. So when I was thinking about companionship and closeness, it was certainly about what does it mean to not try to run from loss, which I think is often the impulse to resolve it, but to simply provide it company and to treat it as something that might require or desire company. I also think, and this kind of goes to some of what you were saying, I think, about your mom and the film project, that for me, writing this book was also trying to find a way to have companionship with my mother in a time when it's hard to be with her.
Yeah.
I do think so much of the US based language about end of life is like how lucky you are to have this time together and may you find deep connection. And much of this period of life is just miserable, right?
Yeah.
It's just it's
Totally.
physically taxing, it's grueling care work, it's anxiety, it's expensive, it's just hard, it's logistically complicated. And so I think there was a way in which writing the book was finding a way to be in companionship with her in
Yeah.
a moment when I don't always know how to be with her, right?
Yeah.
And I think writing the book helped, was a way to do that.
Yeah.
And I think I also wanted to think about how Black feminist theory has positioned itself as doing that work, as providing a kind of companionship to theorists and writers who are navigating loss of different kinds. And so I think it is no surprise that in this kind of like if it's post Black Lives Matter moment, we find so many Black feminist scholars, writers of all different kinds talking about how these are not just texts, these are writers that they live with, right? That whether it's Audre Lorde or Alice Walker or Kimberly Crenshaw or Hortense Spillers, that this is not just about theory or ideas, these are about people who you carry with you, who help you navigate the everyday, who offer companionship. And so when I wanted to think about living with Black feminist theory, I wanted to think about what it would mean to take the tools of my trade, so to speak, right, and think about what they could bring to bear on the and how they could help me not run from loss, right, but sit in it perhaps uncomfortably, but to bear sitting in it for a little while longer.
Yeah. Yeah. That's super beautifully put. I was thinking too about, I had wanted to ask you about writing and what writing does or what writing is in relation to loss. And you just answered so much of it very beautifully because you have this kind of breakdown at the start of the book of like what is the how, what is the we, what is the now, and you kind of skip over writing because that's what you're doing. I get
Right.
that.
Yeah.
But I was thinking so much about writing as and I mean writing pretty expansively, right? Like I think Elizabeth Alexander is talking about like pen to the page writing when she's thinking about the death of her husband and really like writing to mark where she is in the moment. And this kind of, she speaks so beautifully about having this moment as a writer where something horrible and extraordinary is happening, and you understanding as a writer that there's like there's the part of you that's going through it, and there's the part of you also that's going through it, and understanding that as a writer, you have to metabolize through your writing. And I think you are also someone, Jen, am I right, that you're also somebody who, I think you even say in How We Write Now that you like love to sit down and write. You love a kind of, and I'm not a daily writing practice person. I was going to say much to my chagrin, but I actually want to embrace just like my own writing practice, which is not every day. But the period of writing that is about like a kind of massive metabolizing, like by the time I get to writing, a lot has happened in my brain to bring me there to kind of have a vision, but that writing feels also like something that is taking so many forms and doing so many kinds of work.
Right. And I'll say, and I know we have to move to Q&A in a second, but one of the things I've really been thinking about as I've been starting to work on personal essays about my mom and loss is this question of what it means to be too close to something that we write. Because I think as academics, right, we're trained to prize distance of a
Yeah.
certain, right? And the sense that if we're too close, we can't see something for what it is. And so I've been, sort of struggling with this question of like, do I want to write this collection of personal essays right now? Is this the project that I want to be in? Because to be in it is to be mired in the minutia of loss, and maybe I'm too close. And then I stopped and said, maybe being too close is precisely the moment where I should be writing, right? Like
Yeah. And
maybe
also, what does too close even
right,
mean? Like
exactly.
what?
Exactly. And I think to myself, I mean, I thought this when I was writing Birthing Black Mothers, like, oh, there are so many details about birth that I have forgotten, that I have
Yeah.
lost. And
Yeah.
that might be great,
Yeah.
right? Like, that might be fine. But it's like, oh, right, because with distance, right, certain the kind of set cultural narratives about birth and pregnancy have set in, and I have erased the particularities of my experiences and phrases that I said, and weird thoughts that I had. And so what might it mean to actually write in precisely the moment when I'm as close as possible to the scene of loss, and to start there rather than I think my traditional academic demeanor, which is like, well, I should wait until I can adopt a stance of neutrality or objectivity, or I can see the shape of the book from a distance, right? Like give it a year or two. And I'm like, no, I want to remember all of this in all of its horror, right? Like I want to remember all of this because I know that in 5 or 10 or 15 years, the mundane details of this particular kind of loss will be lost, right? And I want to have an archive of it, even if it's unbearable to return to that archive later.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, you ready for some questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Ken, are you going to do this for us? Oh, he came and he left.
If you like, I can.
Yeah, go for it. Why don't you be
Okay.
the voice of
I'll
the
be the
people?
questioner. Yes. Dr. Gail Hamner asks, Dr. Singh and Dr. Nash, I'm compelled by what you indexed as the compulsion to make oneself vulnerable. I appreciate what Dr. Singh said about how this style of vulnerability is a way to signal commitment. Could you, either or both of you, speak a bit more to how this real/style of vulnerability might be a strategy that moves beyond academic objectivity, or what Ferreira da Silva captures as the transparent eye? In other words, I'm curious less about what vulnerability risks or limits than how this vulnerability articulates and clears space for different kinds of academic knowledges and practices. How might this preferential option for intimacy participate in decolonizing the university or otherwise collectively tugging on an otherwise world?
You want to start, Jen?
Sure. First of all, thanks for that question. It's so rich, and I probably won't be able to do justice to it just off the top of my head. But one of the things that I was thinking about as you were reading the question, Ken, and to the point about kind of different forms of academic knowledge, is I was thinking about our exchange, Julietta, about markets and repetition and the ways in which hybrid writing, promiscuous genre writing, right, is not an outlier, at least in the fields that I call home, right? At least in gender and sexuality studies and Black studies. We've cleared space for the note, for critical fabulation, for poetic writing. So I think we actually live in this moment of, again, in the fields that I call home, I think conventional disciplines are different, a kind of proliferation of forms and a sense that I don't necessarily know that I agree with. I'll put those cards on the table, a sense that these different forms of writing decolonize knowledge or upset dominant forms of knowledge. I actually, going back to our conversation about repetition, I'm really interested in how for voices and forms of writing that seem to run counter to the dominant so quickly get absorbed and incorporated, right? So thinking with like Rod Ferguson, who's thinking about that with minoritarian knowledge. So I think the creation for appetites of certain forms of Black feminist writing makes certain forms of Black feminist writing become dominant at those, right? So I'm very interested in that. But I think the kinds of writing that I write about in the book, say Elizabeth Alexander or Sharp or Hartman, I think have become, dominant is too strong a word, prevalent, right?
Yeah.
And I think in Black feminist studies, the field has been remade, in particular through the work of Black feminist historians, whose work I think is increasingly treated not as historiographical, but as theoretical. And I think the last 15 years have been marked by the flourishing of kind of humanistic inquiry within Black feminist studies after the 80s and early 90s, where the field was largely oriented towards the social sciences. So all this to say, I think the kinds of writing that I'm interested in, I think have already reshaped the landscape of Black studies and gender and sexuality studies.
Yeah, great question and great answer, Jen. I guess I would add to that you know, I think the question of transparency, as probably everybody here with us has already thought, can be a real ruse, right? And I think that there's I noticed in the question that decolonizing the university is put in quotation marks, which I really appreciate, because I am someone who thinks that if the university were to be decolonized, it would no longer be the university. And so, you know, I'm always a little bit skeptical of a kind of almost a desperate desire to decolonize the university right now, because I understand that I'm working within a colonial institution through different kinds of discourses that both draw from that colonial knowledge base and knowledge system and attempt to resist it at the same time. I am always thinking with Nathan Snaza's new Duke book, Tendings, who's trying to think about the ways that we're always modulating toward the sort of resistance of colonial knowledge systems and participating and contributing to them at the same time, that there's that kind of like split always happening, and that we don't necessarily need to, we shouldn't refuse that, or we shouldn't ignore that, and Jen, I think your thought is so interesting in that way, when you can kind of see that Black feminist thought is multi-dynamic and not all of it is toward a kind of fugitive politics. Some of it's working very much within kind of institutional knowledge systems and structures. But to the question of vulnerability, I mean, I think I'm really somebody who believes in vulnerability, who understands my education. I'll just speak for myself, that my own education was about a disavowal of my vulnerability while being very vulnerable. And so vulnerability was always there and was always at play. And it wasn't so much something that I had to ignite because of it's already there-ness of my existence within academia, but something that I figured out how to channel, or that I'm figuring out how to channel. And that in channeling that, again, it's not about a kind of gesture of decolonization, but it is about opening up different possibilities for thinking and knowledge production within and really importantly, I think beyond the university. It's a really partial answer, and I would love to have a longer conversation about it.
This was great. We have such nice questions tonight. This is from Kayama Glover. Thank you for this enriching and vulnerable conversation. I may be mistaken, but I don't think the word love has come up explicitly in the conversation yet, although it seems to be so foundational to all that you've been sharing. Closeness, intimacy, companionship, maternity, sisterhood, all these forms of loving relation are swirling together here. So I'd be very keen to hear you both reflect on that so fraught, so weighty term.
A great question.
Yeah.
I think Kemi, you're right to note the absence of that term. I don't know if that term even appears in my book. And as I was hearing Ken read the question, I thought to myself, how do I think about my own my refusal to put that word in the book, right? And so I gestured to this. I mean, I'm interested in, well, I guess I should say a few things. I've long been interested in the place of love in Black feminist theory, right? And thinking about kind of love politics is at the heart of Black feminism. But in the context of this work, I think I'm interested in the mixed feelings that can underpin love, and how Black feminism can how we can generate a voice that can make space for those mixed feelings. So as I said to you, Julietta, I think so often people will say, how wonderful to have this amazing time with your mother. And I think yes, and also how horrible. It's both, right? So I think I'm interested in how love can often not make space as a term for those mixed feelings, right? For those, or, I wrote an essay about my mother a year or two ago, and there was a sentence in there where I said something about how I find it hard to be with her now. And some of that is about the ways in which she's unfamiliar to me. And some of it is about a set of habits which are really common in folks with advanced Alzheimer's that are just, that I find challenging, right? And so part of it is realizing my own attachments to ideas of comfort, my own self-consciousness, right? Like having to really come to face those things, but also just thinking like, I don't like this time, right? This time feels hard. I miss my mother. Like I miss being with someone who was familiar. I miss being able to have a conversation. And so I'm interested in those mixed feelings, and I'm particularly interested in what those mixed feelings have to tell us about loss. I think a lot of the texts that I write about and how we write now want to think about grief as entirely about the loss of someone who was loved in an uncomplicated way. Elizabeth Alexander has a moment in Light of the World where she says something like, my husband and I had our squabbles. There were moments, but anyway, like we always found our way back to each other. And I remember the first time I read that, I circled it and I was like, tell me more.
Yeah.
I want to hear about those challenging moments, right? But there was a sense that a love story, right, which she describes The Light of the World as, requires writing out the moments of mixed feeling, the moments of complexity. And so I think that's part of why maybe I feel allergic is too strong a word. Maybe that's why I tend to avoid that word in the context of this book.
I don't know
Thank
if I should just let that stand for both of us, Jen. I mean, I think about love. Well, we started with friendship, and we're sort of wrapping up with love here. But I think about love a little bit as the sort of like pulse or undercurrent of all of those other terms that we've been deploying: companionship, closeness, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that there's something, Jen, maybe you're resistant to a kind of like one-dimensional notion of love as like just love, I love you, without all of the sort of mess and complexity that can open up through the deployment of other terms. But I think, yeah, I think I'll just say it's interesting that we haven't used love, and that I think that more than anything, to me, it's about the ways that love names the operation of all the other formulations I think that we're talking about, like that love is an undercurrent that's sort of pulsing below all these other forms, and that it's not in just the way that you described, Jen, like it's not it's not always easy, and it's a struggle in the same way that this is sort of like our love for our mothers is a complicated love based on where we were with them, where we are with them, where we're arriving with them, etc.
And so I think, I mean, as you were saying that, Julietta, I was just reminded of, you know, why did I react the way that I did to the idea of love? And I was thinking about the ways in which love and care, I think, is another term that circulates similarly, not just in Black feminist spaces, but kind of writ large in the fields that we call home, and also in left political spaces, and how so often these terms hide aggression, violence, boredom, gendered labor, right? Like they can hide so much of that. And so I think part of my desire, maybe in circumventing using the word love, is to push back on the kind of romances that I think can animate a lot of Black feminist conversations about love and care, that these are sort of the be all end all, right? That this is the political project, and that actually so much of what happens, say, under the umbrella of care actually sucks, right? So much of it is backbreaking work, right? And I want to hold on to that, while also holding on to the fact that, as you said at the beginning of our time together, friendship is utterly important and sustaining, right? That these kind of bonds really matter. So I want to hold on to both of those at the same time.
But also the question's so interesting, Jen, because every text that we're talking about, the ones we've written, the ones we're engaging with in this conversation, the ones that you engage with and how we write now, are all about love relations, right? Like,
Yeah.
that, but all the other kind of forces that are swirling around that sort of elemental relation of love, and the complexity comes from losing love, or losing, the loss of love, and the beautiful ways in which we engage with that loss. But anyway, love. Happy to have the word and the feeling in the room.
Well, yes, I was going to say we can move from love to a more safe genre question.
Right.
Linda Maria Grasso, thank you for this wonderfully rich conversation. I'd like to hear more about the use of the epistolary form, particularly in a time in which so few people write letters. Also, is there a gender difference in the use of the form?
Is there a gender difference in the use of the form?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. Yes, I think there's a gender difference in the use of the form, at least in terms of the text that we're discussing today. It's a super interesting question to think about, why the letter at a time when nobody writes letters anymore. Some of us still write letters. But I think in a really, I think the thing that I love about the epistolary form as a writer is that it moves us directly to a subject, to my daughter, to my mother, to whomever I'm writing to, but in a way that immediately becomes super elastic. And so the epistolary form for me is one that is a beautiful kind of holding space for the specific and the elastic at the same time, that we can be writing to a singular. There's this really beautiful moment in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale where she says, you could mean one and you could mean thousands. I'm paraphrasing. But the idea is that when I'm writing to you, the you can be immeasurable and the you can be singular. And so I think for me, the writing to my daughter, the act of kind of employing the epistolary, of leaning into the epistolary, was really wanting to give something to a singular subject, while also thinking about how this relation of love, see how I did that, between myself and my daughter could also be a way of moving our relationship into a much broader political horizon, and at the same time undoing the singularity of the you that she is and the you that I am in the writing of that text. That in writing to someone, we're actually recreating both of us and all of us at the same time.
Julietta, that was awesome. I love your reflections on how the letter is both specific and generalizable. I think it's also interesting to think about what the letter does to us, the reader, right? What is it to feel like we're reading something that we know is a device? The letter is a device, but we also are allowed to entertain the fiction that we're reading something that wasn't meant for us, and that
Mhm.
we can hold simultaneously that fiction.
Yes. And
rather than
Jen, it's
eavesdropping.
also, it's eavesdropping,
Right, it's
which we
eavesdropping.
haven't talked about. Jen writes really interestingly about being a nosy child and an eavesdropper in this book, and I really loved it. And we didn't get there in this conversation. So
But I do think that is part of the tremendous appeal and power of the letter. It allows us to feel like we're accessing something that didn't anticipate us, even though of course it did.
Mhm.
And I think that's where Perry's Breathe is so interesting, because at the very end, she entirely breaks the letter form.
Mhm.
So the book is written as a letter to her son. And at the very end, she's like, what if I didn't write this book as a letter? What would
Mhm.
that mean? And suddenly the device is dropped, right? You're like,
Mhm.
wait a second, is this a letter? Is this not a letter? So I think
Mhm.
there is something about that sentiment that we're accessing something that didn't anticipate us, which also requires us to ask, who am I in relationship to the you, right? Am I
Yeah.
part of the you? Am I outside of the you, right? And I think that's
Yeah.
such a powerful question to have to ask as a reader.
Totally. And in the breaks, I was really clear, like I had written Unthinking Mastery, so checked off my tenure book, and I had written No Archival will Restore You. And I was like, okay, I did these two things that I really wanted to do. And now I actually want to turn as a then young mom to like really doing something like to inform my kid. And I really wasn't certain that it was for a wider audience. And I wanted to write it as though it wasn't. And I think that that's part of the like understanding myself as a like hybrid person who's always like Jen, you're reading the book and being like, what is this? Means that I'm never going to be a mass marketable person. And that's like for me a good thing, because it means the thing can be something that isn't meant for everyone. But then when others find it, it has a kind of sponginess and there's space in it, there's room in it for people to enter and kind of find themselves or find others through it.
So let me, do we have time can you hang on for one more question? Or what I thought I'd do is ask two questions, which I thought go together well, perhaps either side of the same hand. One from Brianna Simmons. Thank you both for your time and reflection. I'd like to bring back your question, why am I unmoved? And how your conversation today confirms that we become who and we are through and with others, that we become who we are through and with others. With respect to those tenors of grief and creation that beautiful writing sacredly mirrors, what is it that this way of writing that allows you to accept and understand something about Black life underneath? Question mark. Antisocial relegations across diaspora generations and the human. And I thought that might go well with the question that followed it from Giovanna Jones. How do we write about Black women with reverence and complexity while also resisting the market for sacred Black mothers, grandma's hands, and mammy? When I write with my own Black mother and grandmothers in mind, I feel afraid that I'm giving the public room to fulfill their own desires for proximity to a kind of sacred Black maternal nurture, intimacy, etc.
Jen, these are questions for you.
Hi. So first, thanks to two friends for asking those questions. Those are fantastic. Giovanna, I hear you. I don't know that I necessarily have an answer to the question that you're asking, except that I think it's important to constantly call attention to the appetite for Black feminist writing to take on certain forms and for Black women to appear in certain kinds of ways in the writing. In other words, to name that appetite and even to name the anxiety that we write in a certain way, or that our mothers or foremothers appear in a certain way. I think it's important to call attention to that. I think one of the things I realized when writing this book was that there was a way in which writing a story about my mother, a Black woman with Alzheimer's, confounded a paradigm of Black law. So that one of the comments that I got early on was like, what does this book have to do with race? And it was, and in a way I was like, well, that's the point. Like part of what I'm trying to push against is a frame of Black loss that can't understand the ways that I'm narrating my mother's slow loss as a form of Black loss. Like, why can't she fall within that paradigm? But it also, to me, revealed precisely the appetite for a certain kind of Black feminist writing and a certain kind of representation of, say, Black loss or Black life that I was hoping to refuse or challenge. So I think it's important that we keep putting pressure on that. Brianna, I'm not going to do justice to your question. I want to say something about the beginning, the idea of why am I unmoved? I often say this to my students when I'm teaching. It's amazing how we are saturated with images of horror, and for 30 seconds we're moved by them, and then we completely move on. Right, there was a day a couple of years ago when I was teaching undergraduates, and we were talking about school shootings, and we were like, "Oh, there was another school shooting. Anyway, how are things going?" And I was like, "Wait, wait, how do we think about that?" Right? I think of that moment in Ordinary Notes where Christina Sharp is talking about having a conversation with her brother, and he says something like, "I'm so sad today." And she says, "Why are you sad?" And then she later reflects, "Why wouldn't you be sad? There are so many things to be sad about, right? Like, look at the world that we're living in." So I think, part of my attraction to the question of why am I unmoved is that it holds us accountable in a certain way for a kind of numbness that I think is a totally reasonable coping strategy for the conditions of the present, but it calls it into attention. It requires that we think about the ethics of numbness and what it might mean to allow ourselves to fully grieve the multiple kinds of losses that are unfolding in the present. So again, I'm not doing total justice to your question, but thank you for it.
No, that was an incredibly deep and beautiful answer. So, we have other great questions left, but I think we're really out of time. And I'm sad about that because this has been such a generative and fantastic discussion. And so I'm extremely grateful to you both and thankful. And thanks to everybody for coming and for being here and for all your contributions. And I hope everybody has a good and peaceful and thoughtful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Ken.
Julietta. Thank you, Ken. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.